What if being 13 minutes late could change your entire life? In the grand lobby of the Holloway Hotel, a brass bell rings sharp, relentless, echoing the weight of discipline. Oliver Grant, the man who believes time is trust and trust is everything, watches with cold precision. Then enters Grace Bennett, breathless, damp from the sea air, her twins tugging at her coat, a cardboard box already waiting for her belongings. Just one late morning, and the fragile balance of survival she's built begins to collapse. But is punctuality worth more than dignity? Is control stronger than compassion? And what happens when two very different worlds, one ruled by wealth and rigid order, the other by resilience and quiet sacrifice, collide in ways neither expected? As laughter, secrets, and unspoken wounds weave through this story, we are left to wonder, can Oliver's fortress of discipline ever crumble into something tender? Can Grace's steady courage teach him what it means to truly live? Stay with us as we unfold a journey of heartbreak, resilience, and the fragile hope of connection. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so together we can step into the first chapter of their lives. A brass bell chimed in the lobby of the Holloway as the clock struck 8. Its sharp tone cut through the scent of brewed coffee and lemon polish on the old mahogany counter. For Oliver Grant, owner of the historic hotel, the bell was more than a decoration. It was a reminder that time was the only currency that never forgave waste. Every late minute, in his mind, was a broken promise. Upstairs, his suite overlooked Cannon Beach. The ocean stretched gray and endless, the tide creeping in with its slow authority. Oliver's morning was a ritual gym at 6. Cold shower, pressed shirt, black tie knotted without a crease. By 7:30, he was seated with a laptop, reviewing the day's investor call. Winter cuts loomed. Occupancy numbers dipped after October, and pressure to trim the fat grew louder each year. He adjusted his cufflinks and skimmed through the deck, each slide another blade against his staff's security. Discipline steadied him. Discipline had carried him out of a timber town childhood where his father measured worth in obedience and silence. He kept that voice close, even when it scraped his chest raw. At 8:13, the side door swung open. Grace Bennett hurried across the polished floor, breath uneven, hair damp with sea mist clinging in fine curls. She clutched her tote as if bracing against more than the wind. 13 minutes. Second strike this week. He noticed. He always noticed. Mr. Grant, she began, voice calm, though her lungs fought her. The bus was delayed. I stopped long enough to walk my twins into preschool. I'm sorry. No excuses, no pleading, just a statement offered with dignity. Her cheeks carried the chill of the morning. Her shoes left faint damp marks on the floor. Oliver did not reply at once. Hank Sorensen, the hotel's general manager, stood a step behind him, thick ledger in hand. Hank had warned her earlier in the week after the first tardy. Now his eyes rested on the marble tiles, heavy with what he knew was coming. Grace, Oliver said finally. Measured, even. We've had this conversation. Timeliness is not optional. You understand the expectations. She nodded once, lips pressed. You're relieved of your position, effective immediately. The words dropped like weights. Hank shifted, clearing his throat, but did not interrupt. Oliver gestured to the HR packet already prepared on his desk. Your final paycheck is enclosed. Badge, please. Grace slid the lanyard from her neck, set it on the desk. She reached for the cardboard box Hank had placed by the door. Inside, a framed photograph, a mug painted with a child's handprint, a notebook filled with her neat script. A corner of bright paper stuck out the yellow sun, drawn in crayon, smiling in uneven strokes. Oliver's eyes caught on it before he looked away. Something pulled at him, something he quickly shoved down. Grace lifted the box with steady arms. She said nothing more, because what could words add? Hank shifted again, uncomfortable, as she turned and walked toward the glass doors. The Pacific squall outside spotted her coat before she reached the street. Guests in the lobby glanced up as she passed, some offering polite half-smiles, most pretending not to notice. Grace's chin remained level. Her steps were measured, not hurried. She would not let the crack show here. The brass bell, the same one that had marked her lateness, swayed lightly in the draft of the closing door. Its faint echo lingered in Oliver's chest longer than he expected. He returned to the board deck, but the slide titles blurred, numbers and margins, bullet points and graphs. He read them twice and could not fix them in memory. The yellow sun drawn by a child pressed behind his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if his father had been wrong. Down the street. Grace shifted the box to her hip and braced herself against the wind funneling between storefronts. The sea roared louder than usual, or maybe she just heard it differently now. Each step carried her farther from the brass bell's chime, yet its echo followed her. The hotel's windows reflected gray light back into Oliver's office. He straightened his tie, clicked to the next slide, and told himself he had done what discipline required. Still, when the bell moved slightly in the lobby draft, he heard it again, sharp and clear, like a question he had no answer for. Grace climbed the narrow steps above the bait shop, balancing a cardboard box and 3 grocery bags that smelled faintly of brine. The wood beneath her boots creaked, worn soft by decades of fishermen and tenants who came before her. Rent was due next week. The thought settled in her chest heavier than the box itself. Inside, the small rental was warm with the scent of oatmeal and lemon cleaner. On the kitchen table sat Mary Ann Bennett's pill sorter, lids marked with bright letters for each day. Beside it lay a stack of library books, spines cracked from repeated readings of fairy tales and picture stories. 2 sets of small sneakers were lined by the door. On the fridge, artwork taped crookedly suns with big eyes, stick figure families holding hands, blue scribbles that were meant to be whales. Mary Ann looked up from her chair near the window. 63, silver hair pinned back, eyes that still held humor despite a heart that gave her trouble. She teased lightly as Grace set the box down. Fired, and you still brought home groceries. Maybe you're better at magic than numbers. Grace smiled, though it was thin. Bananas were on sale. The kids won't complain. The twins Ava and Eli came tumbling in from the small bedroom, holding construction paper crowns they had made at preschool. Ava asked if her drawing from the fridge could be framed like the one in the box. Grace nodded, touching her daughter's cheek. Their life had always been measured in little exchanges like this. A laugh despite the bills. A crown cut from scrap paper that made a child feel royal. The Subaru sat useless at the curb, hood streaked with salt. It hadn't started in weeks. Grace had mapped bus transfers on sticky notes stuck above the counter, pink for the museum, yellow for the diner, green for the clinic. Preschool hours were circled in red, a constant reminder that childcare had no room for overtime. Across town, Oliver Grant began his day in a far different rhythm. His suite overlooked the ocean. His mornings moved like clockwork, each task folded into the next without hesitation. As he adjusted his cufflinks, he recalled his father's gravel voice teaching him that comfort made men weak. His father had prized stoicism above all else, turning every feeling into a test to be endured. Oliver trusted control because it never failed him. Kindness, in his father's eyes, was a distraction. He had carried that belief into his empire of hotels. The town itself balanced between both worlds. On one side, people like Grace juggling rent, buses, meals, medicine. On the other, the grandeur of the Holloway, standing tall against wind and tide, a symbol of prosperity. In between was the community that knit them all together. Vera Muse tended the church garden, where kale and marigolds grew side by side. Neighbors waved from porches. Tourists strolled the beach with cameras, not knowing the layers of lives tucked in behind the storefronts. At the table, Grace opened a folder of budget envelopes. Each held a thin stack of bills marked for rent, food, utilities. She slipped in a $5 bill from her wallet, knowing it would not stretch enough. The job she had lost had been steady. Now, she recalculated, shifting numbers around as if they could multiply by will alone. She resolved to apply anywhere that offered daytime hours. The twins needed routine, and Marianne's health meant nights away were impossible. She folded the envelopes neatly, tucking them back into the folder like fragile secrets. Marianne teased again, voice light though her hands trembled. Maybe you'll find work at the bakery. They always need early risers. Grace smiled, but her mind chased through postings she had seen: museum, diner, front desk at the clinic. None promised enough. All demanded more than she had. The contrast between her world and Oliver's sharpened like a line drawn in wet sand. She did not resent him. She had no time for resentment. But the weight of survival pressed harder when she remembered his certainty, the cold clarity in his eyes as he ended her job. Outside, gulls cried over the surf. The bait shop below smelled of salt and old rope. The tide moved in and out as if mocking the fragile balance above it. As Ava and Eli built towers from library books, Marianne laughed at their antics. The sound lifted for a moment, then broke suddenly. She pressed a hand to her chest, face paling. Grace was at her side in an instant, steadying her. The laughter turned to shallow breaths. Grace's eyes flicked to the calendar pinned above the stove, then to the insurance card resting beside the pill sorter. Numbers and dates closed in like walls. Rent due, coverage ending, time running out. The room held its breath as Grace helped her mother to the chair again, praying it was just fatigue and not something worse. The clinic lights hummed overhead, steady and cold. Grace sat in the plastic chair, her hands folded around a paper receipt that stretched longer than her grocery list. Numbers marched down the strip in neat black ink, each line another drain she could not stop. Insurance would end in 30 days. That knowledge pulsed at the back of her skull, heavier than the buzzing lights. Marianne lay in the next room, a cuff wrapped around her arm. Vitals monitored. The nurse's calm voice said, "Just precaution." But Grace's stomach stayed tight. A simple check turned into blood work, a prescription, and a copay that looked small on paper but large in her wallet. She slid the receipt into her tote, fingers brushing the edges of her HR packet. It still felt unreal, the way her 10 years at the Holloway had reduced to stapled pages. Severance thin, Cobra continuation crushing, job references limited to dates employed. No mention of loyalty, extra hours, or quiet sacrifices. Just numbers, just dates. Outside, wind pressed against the clinic windows. She thought of the rent notice folded on the kitchen table at home. The landlord had been patient last month. This time he had written in plain words, "Increase effective December, no exceptions." The amount was not enormous to some, but to her it was a mountain. She had already used every grace period offered. Back on the bus, she held the metal pole as the vehicle jolted. A toddler cried in the back row. Grace watched the mother dig for snacks. Recognizing the fatigue in her eyes, she pressed her own lips together, thinking of Ava and Eli waiting with their paper crowns. The day blurred with errands. At the pharmacy, she swiped her card again, watching the balance shrink. At home, she marked due dates on the calendar in red ink, each square filling with pressure. She applied for jobs with a steady hand. First, at the Maritime Museum front desk attendant. Visitor services. The director scanned her resume, eyebrows raised. "You're overqualified," he said gently. "We need part-timers who can rotate weekends. I'm afraid it won't be a fit." She tried again at the diner 2 streets over. The manager looked her up and down, asked if she could work late nights, double shifts. Grace explained about the twins, the hours she could manage. He shook his head. "We need flexibility. Sorry. 2 tries. 2 closed doors." She walked home with the salt wind in her hair, gripping the straps of her tote. Failure settled cold against her ribs. Not because she wasn't capable, but because life refused to bend around the limits she carried. At the Holloway, Oliver clicked into his investor call. His suit was pressed, his notes prepared, his tone clipped. Charts flashed across the shared screen: occupancy down, margins thin, winter ahead. The men on the line spoke of lean operations and strategic reductions. Oliver's chest tightened, though he kept his voice steady. He had promised discipline, promised results. Cutting payroll seemed simple when viewed from the top floor. He agreed, his mouth shaping the words even as his heart pressed against his ribs. After the call, silence filled his office. He turned toward the window where waves broke against basalt rock. For a moment, he felt the tide's relentless push inside his own chest. Then he straightened his tie, shut the laptop, and told himself it was necessary. For Grace, necessity looked different. It meant stretching oatmeal over 3 breakfasts. It meant marking sticky notes for bus routes when the car sat useless. It meant circling job ads in ink even when the hours didn't match her life. Late that afternoon, she returned from the clinic with Marianne. Her mother smiled faintly, saying she felt better. Grace placed her gently in the chair by the window, tucked a blanket over her knees, and tried to believe the smile. She pulled out the receipts again. White paper, black numbers, red ink on the calendar. Together they crowded the small table. She lined up envelopes labeled rent, food, utilities, meds, each thinner than last month. She moved a $5 bill from one to the other, as if that small act could change the outcome. Her twins darted in, crown slipping sideways, asking for another story. Grace read from the library book, her voice even, though her mind swirled. The words on the page blurred at the edges. She read slowly anyway, because children deserve stories even when the world felt like a narrowing tunnel. As night fell, she stepped outside to dump the trash. The sky hung low, the air damp with sea spray. Her breath formed a cloud that disappeared as quickly as it came. Down the street, she heard faint laughter from the church garden where volunteers worked late. Children's voices drifted over the fence, carrying warmth into the cold. Grace paused, one hand on the tote strap. The gate stood open, a soft light spilling across the path. For reasons she couldn't name, her feet turned in that direction. Dusk lowered over Cannon Beach, the sky a soft wash of violet and gray. Grace knelt in damp soil between kale stalks and bright marigolds. The church garden sat quiet, save for the shuffle of small hands pressing seeds into earth. Ava and Eli crouched beside her, their thumbs dark with soil, their laughter rising in little bursts. She hummed as she worked, the tune an old lullaby her mother used when nights stretched long and money ran short. The melody carried across rows of vegetables, steady and low, a rhythm older than worry. The garden had become her sanctuary. Wooden beds lined the yard, each with a small sign scrawled in children's handwriting: carrots, beans, squash. Painted rocks marked corners, chipped but cheerful. Vera Muse, who organized the space, moved quietly in the distance, watering can tilted, her nod soft and knowing as she passed. Grace's pulse slowed as she pressed soil over the seeds. The repetition soothed her dig, place, cover, pat. Ava asked if plants could hear songs. Grace smiled, telling her that everything grows better when tended with care. Eli pushed a seed too deep, and she guided his hand back gently, teaching patience one small motion at a time. The song wrapped around them, gentler than words. For a moment, the world's demands faded, the bus routes, the rent notice, the insurance card all stilled beneath the hush of evening and the weight of her voice. Beyond the fence, footsteps slowed. Oliver Grant had taken his usual evening walk to clear his head, to make the day's decisions feel less like verdicts. The path wound past the church lot, its chain-link fence lined with climbing beans. He might have walked past, but the sound stopped him. He stood in the shadow of the fence, still as the oak nearby. The lullaby floated through the cool air, each note a thread pulling at something inside him he thought long buried. He watched Grace bend toward her children, her face lit with calm that seemed impossible given what he knew of her days. What he had not seen in the office, what numbers never showed, was here in plain view. Gentleness under strain, steadiness without applause. He thought of her standing in the lobby, holding that cardboard box without complaint, her chin level as she walked through the rain. Now he saw the same woman pressing seeds with her children, singing them into courage. The wire fence could not keep the song from him. It moved through the metal, through the fog, through the tight walls he had built since boyhood. He felt it loosen something in his chest. His father's voice, always urging hardness, suddenly sounded hollow against this quiet hymn. He stayed longer than he meant to, until Vera glanced toward the fence and gave him a nod that made him realize he had been caught listening. He raised a hand awkwardly, then turned back toward the road. His condo greeted him with silence. Minimalist lines, polished counters, a view of the sea that most men would envy. Yet tonight it felt hollow. He set his keys down on the granite island, their clink too sharp. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, each sound stretched into emptiness. He poured a glass of water and stood at the window. Waves rolled against basalt rocks, unbothered by human precision. He tried to summon his usual armor numbers, plans, discipline, but the lullaby lingered. He could still see the tilt of Grace's head as she sang, the way the children leaned against her like seedlings needing warmth. He carried the glass to his bedroom, but sleep would not come. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ocean's slow breath. The echo of the song folded around him, not demanding, not sharp, only present. Oliver had seen hundreds of employees leave his company. None stayed with him beyond the paperwork. Yet Grace's presence followed him home, not as guilt alone, but as a question, what if discipline was not the only way to measure worth? He turned on his side, restless. The lullaby wove through his thoughts until dawn threatened the horizon. He did not name the decision forming in him, but it took root all the same. The morning air was cool, damp with ocean salt. Grace opened her front door and stopped. 2 brown paper bags waited on the step, folded neatly at the top. She bent down, heart catching, and peeked inside. Bananas, a box of oatmeal, cartons of milk, and children's vitamins. On top lay a small envelope with 4 plain words: a neighbor who cares. She lifted the bags carefully, glancing down the quiet street. No one lingered. The bait shop below still slept, its closed signs swaying lightly in the breeze. Inside, Ava and Eli came running when they saw the fruit. Strawberries tumbled out of the second bag, bright as jewels. The children squealed, holding them high like treasure. They bit into them, juice spilling down their chins, giggling as if summer had arrived early. Grace leaned on the counter, throat tight. The kindness was simple, but it cracked something in her chest. She had grown used to carrying the weight alone. Now someone had reached into that silence and set down food. Later that week, she found a folded slip in the mailbox, a voucher from a reputable mechanic in town, Safe Start Repair. She almost ignored it, fearing a trick, but desperation nudged her forward. At the garage, the mechanic nodded when she handed over the slip. Paid in full, he said, and set to work without question. Hours later, the Subaru's engine coughed, sputtered, then settled into a steady idle. The sound was rough, but alive. Grace gripped the steering wheel, feeling something loosen inside her. For weeks she had walked past the silent car, a reminder of everything stalled. Now, against all odds, it breathed again. That evening, she drove the twins down to the pier. It wasn't far, but the ride itself felt like freedom. Ava rolled down her window to let the sea spray in. Eli hummed to himself, kicking his feet against the seat. Grace sat straighter behind the wheel, the hum of the engine filling her with cautious hope. At the church garden, Vera mentioned in passing that the Maritime Museum might be looking for someone for a daytime desk job. A friend of a friend mentioned it, she said with a shrug. You'd be good there. Grace circled the date of the application deadline in her notebook. It was not guaranteed, but it was a chance. That night, she pulled out her envelopes again. For the first time since losing her job, she slipped money inside without dread. Not enough to fix everything, but enough to keep trying. Her gratitude grew, wary but real. Someone had chosen to help, quietly, without asking for thanks. She didn't know who. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe someone from church. She told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was that kindness still existed, and she wasn't invisible after all. In the small kitchen, she poured milk over the oatmeal. Ava and Eli sat at the table, feet swinging above the floor. They cheered when she set the bowls down, still talking about the strawberries they had eaten that morning. Grace laughed softly, a sound that surprised even her. It had been days since laughter had come easily. She touched the rim of her mug, letting the warmth steady her. Hope was fragile. It had to be handled like glass, but she let it sit on the table with them that morning, next to the bowls and crayons. The Subaru keys lay on the counter. She picked them up, felt their weight, and smiled. A small turn of metal had given her back the sound of possibility. Tomorrow, she would go to the museum. Tomorrow, she would keep going. The Sunday tide retreated slowly, revealing shallow pools and wet sand that glittered like crushed glass. Grace adjusted the dented thermos in her hands, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. Cocoa, bitter and sweet, slid into the paper cups she had lined up for the twins. Ava's hair stuck to her damp forehead. Eli's cheeks were rosy from the wind. Both of them pointed, laughed, and dug tiny fingers into the sand. Oliver crouched beside Ava, his coat brushing the wet sand, pointing out a starfish clinging to a tide pool rock. The child's eyes followed his gesture, rapt and trusting. Eli lined pebbles by color, his small fingers meticulous and deliberate. Oliver watched him, noting the patience he displayed without noticing himself. He hadn't realized how much he craved that simplicity, that attention to someone else's tiny victories. Grace poured cocoa, handing the cups carefully to the children. Her eyes lifted to Oliver for a brief moment. There was a quiet acknowledgement in the exchange he was present, yet careful not to intrude. She sensed a shift. He came here with a purpose, yes, but his pace softened in response to hers. By the sand and tide pools, they moved in small rituals, picking up shells, testing the temperature of water in their hands, showing each other the smallest creatures hidden under seaweed. Later, under a quilt spread on a weathered pier bench, picture books opened and closed. The twins leaned into Grace's side, occasionally glancing at Oliver as if measuring his presence, learning whether he was trustworthy. Oliver began to speak quietly, sharing fragments of his past, childhood rules learned in a stern household. Grace listened with gentle patience. She didn't interrupt, didn't attempt to fix. She only nodded when the pauses stretched, sensing the lonely boy behind the adult, understanding how years of control had shaped him. Marianne's voice carried from the porch above, dry and slightly teasing, offering a moment of levity. "Don't let him scare the tide creatures, Grace, or he'll be cleaning sand out of his suits for weeks." Grace smiled, allowing the humor to tether the morning in reality. Oliver laughed softly, a sound unfamiliar to him in its casual settings. He felt the ice cracking, almost imperceptibly. In a quiet corner, Oliver's phone buzzed a reminder from Hank about winter cuts and investor pressure. The buzz pulled him back briefly, his chest tightening. He tensed, but did not leave. The reminder was a tether to his previous life, the edges of his responsibilities sharp and cold. Yet here, in this sand and sea cocoon, his edges softened. He was learning that trust could be built in small, patient steps. The twins tested him effortlessly. Ava offered him a seaweed-covered shell. Eli placed a striped pebble in his hand. These gestures required nothing in return except attention. Oliver felt the warmth of inclusion, a rare gift for someone used to authority and control. He realized he hadn't felt this way in years, needed, yet unpressured, trusted without condition. Grace observed quietly. She had seen kindness, yes, in strangers before, but she recognized when someone was hesitant to give it. Oliver's movements were deliberate, careful, but the intention was clear. He wanted to belong in this moment, and he wanted to be steady for her and the twins. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at hair and jacket collars. The tide pools mirrored the gray sky, reflecting streaks of clouds that moved like watercolors. The squall that would come later was still distant, but it seemed to hover in the periphery, a reminder that life's unpredictability remained. Still, for this moment, they were tethered to the sand, to the small acts of care, to the ritual of morning cocoa and collected shells. Oliver offered to help carry some of the small buckets back toward the pier stairs. The gesture was subtle, and Grace allowed it. She felt the quiet unfolding of trust, the softening of boundaries that had once been rigid. The twins followed, laughing at each other, at him, at Grace. Their trust was unspoken but tangible. Lunch was simple leftover soup from the hotel kitchen, reheated in Grace's modest pot. Oliver learned to appreciate small victories, the perfect spoonful of broth, the child's delighted exclamation over a carrot slice. He found joy in the ordinariness, a sharp contrast to boardroom spreadsheets and investor demands. The children laughed when he made an exaggerated frown at the soup, and Ava snorted, spilling cocoa on her quilt. Oliver didn't flinch. He cleaned it gently, his hands brushing hers for a moment, and Grace noticed the small hesitations in his chest ease. The afternoon sun dipped, casting long shadows across the pier planks. Oliver stayed, sharing quiet conversation with Grace and Marianne. They spoke in fragments, exchanging stories of the town, of little-known beach paths, of how to tide pool without disturbing the creatures. Each story was a stitch in the fabric of connection, softening him further, grounding him in the shared rhythm of life. As the tide returned, rolling gently beneath the pier, Oliver felt a pang of realization. This morning had shifted something inside him. He understood, for the first time in a long while, the meaning of small rituals, of steady presence. These moments were powerful, forming the invisible framework of trust and attachment. The twins held hands, forming a small chain between Grace and Oliver. The gesture was accidental, yet deliberate in their own way. They had folded him into their lives with quiet simplicity. For Oliver, the weight of responsibility, the constant pressure, the fear of being too late or too harsh, all of it faded in these minutes of shared focus and laughter. Clouds thickened overhead. A hint of a squall whispered through the wind, teasing the edges of the pier. The scent of salt and wet wood filled the air. Grace adjusted her quilt around the twins, her eyes meeting Oliver's. They shared an understanding, wordless but profound. Whatever came next, this morning had woven them together, tethered them to each other and to possibility. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Oliver's work would demand precision. Grace's tasks would test patience and endurance. But here, under the sky and beside the tide, a connection had been formed. Bonds were no longer theoretical. They were tangible, felt in the grip of small hands and the warmth of shared cocoa. The wind rose slightly, a prelude to the squall, carrying a whisper of what was to come. Yet, for now, they lingered, hesitant to leave the comfort of shared presence. The morning tide had revealed more than starfish and shells. It had unveiled trust, subtle and resilient, forming quietly beneath the shadow of adult worry. Grace packed up the thermos and blankets, securing the small treasures of sand and memory into a bag. Oliver followed, careful to step on the planks without splashing water. The children scampered ahead, laughing. In that laughter, in those small gestures of kindness and attention, Oliver glimpsed the possibility of a different life, one threaded with connection rather than command. He would leave this pier and return to his world of spreadsheets and investor calls. But a part of him, the part softened by morning cocoa, tide pools, and trust would remain tethered here, in the rhythm of a small, gentle household, where patience and care created something far stronger than authority ever could. Rain arrived suddenly, sweeping across the beach with the urgency of something unannounced. It pattered against the old wooden planks, echoing in the hollow spaces beneath the pier. The twins squealed, spinning in shallow puddles, boots squishing, tiny hands flailing with delight. Grace held their hands for a moment, letting the water splash against her coat. She felt cold, yes, but also alive in a way she hadn't in years. Oliver followed behind, keeping his coat tight, hands tucked into pockets, but he couldn't resist the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. There was something freeing about the chaos of children and weather combined. He watched Ava twirl until her braids stuck to her wet cheeks. Eli leap and stumble, catching raindrops on his tongue. Grace's laughter cut through the drumming of rain on wood. The sound anchored him. They found a piling large enough to provide partial shelter. Water ran off the sides, dripping in irregular patterns onto sand and boards. The scent of salt and wet wood filled the air. They pressed close, Grace letting her shoulder brush his, her hair damp against his chest. She shivered, not from cold but from something more tender, a lowering of guard, a permission to feel present without vigilance. Oliver glanced down at her, noticing the small furrows of worry that had never fully left her forehead. She was cautious, as all who carried the weight of children alone must be. But there was a softness now. He had glimpsed it before in the garden, in small domestic rituals, but the rain made it intimate, immediate, undeniable. The twins, momentarily distracted by a flock of gulls skimming low over the water, ran ahead, their squeals punctuating the steady drum of rain. That brief absence created a bubble of privacy under the piling. Grace exhaled, allowing herself a slow, deliberate breath. "I haven't felt this safe in years," she admitted, voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. Oliver's eyes softened. He leaned closer, his hands brushing hers as he mirrored her posture. "I've never felt at home anywhere," he confessed, words hesitant yet certain. The confessions hung between them, fragile as raindrops, yet heavier than any boardroom decision, any spreadsheet he had ever signed off on. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply breathed, the sound of water and wind filling the space. Then, slowly, naturally, a first kiss, a careful press of lips, brief, intimate, earned by weeks of shared moments, trust quietly cultivated. It was a kiss that required no fanfare, no grand gestures, only the simplicity of two people recognizing a connection forged in attention, patience, and presence. The twins ran back, their laughter rising again, breaking the spell and returning them to the world of puddles and wet shoes. Grace and Oliver stepped back, hands lingering for a heartbeat before letting go. They laughed softly, realizing how absurd it was to stand soaked on a pier in winter rain. Yet neither cared. Walking home, the world blurred with drizzle, coats clung to damp clothes, shoes squished against the sand and pavement. Yet the weight of the morning, the afternoon, and this small, significant kiss made the air feel light. Grace felt something flicker inside her, a sense of belonging, a fragile yet insistent claim that life could be gentle, that she could allow herself to be cared for, even loved. Oliver kept pace beside her, quiet, letting the sound of children's laughter lead them. He noticed the details, the small stones scattered in the puddles, the curl of Ava's braid damp with rain, the smell of salt in Grace's hair. The world felt sharper, yet softer at once. Every dripping plank, every wind-blown coat, became a memory stitched into this first acknowledgement of possibility. By the time they reached the house, coats clinging, hair plastered, they were laughing at how ridiculous they must appear to any passerby. Grace's mother, Mary Ann, shook her head with an indulgent smile, handing towels and dry blankets. "You two look like storm refugees," she said lightly. The children squealed and wriggled into towels, oblivious to anything but warmth and comfort. Inside, the warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the chill outside. Oliver noticed how naturally he settled into the rhythm of the home. There were no walls between them here, only the quiet rituals of drying hair, stacking boots, and passing plates of simple food. It was domestic, intimate, grounding. Grace watched Oliver help the twins peel socks from wet feet. She felt a rush of gratitude and a twinge of surprise at the depth of her own response. She realized she was already imagining more mornings like this, more shared meals, more laughter threading through the mundane. Later, when the twins were tucked in, their soft breathing punctuating the quiet, Oliver lingered near the window. He traced raindrops racing down the pane, reflecting on the day. The kiss under the pier was more than a spark. It was a quiet declaration, a pivot that made secrets and old fears heavier, But in a meaningful way, love had entered, and with it, the weight of truth, honesty, and openness. Grace joined him by the window, shoulders brushing his lightly. They watched the rain together, sharing a comfortable silence that said more than words could. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, unpredictable, urgent, yet cleansing, moving them forward towards something neither had fully named but both recognized. The evening stretched, the rain easing into a drizzle. Oliver lingered a while longer, unwilling to break the fragile connection by turning away. Grace noticed the tension in his posture, the careful way he balanced presence with hesitation. The day had altered them both, stitching a subtle thread of hope into a life that had been frayed by routine, loss, and expectation. They finally moved to chairs by the fire, drying off and letting warmth settle into bones chilled by wind and water. The twins murmured in sleep upstairs, unaware that the small adult rituals below had shifted the course of multiple lives. Oliver and Grace exchanged a glance, knowing this was only the beginning, that love often arrived quietly, without announcement, in the rain, in puddles, in the small insistence of shared presence. The storm outside softened to gentle taps, the pier invisible in the dark beyond the window. Oliver's mind churned quietly. The weight of secrecy, old habits, and future decisions pressed him differently now. Love had arrived. It was comforting and complicated, bright and fragile all at once. He lay awake long after Grace had retreated to her room, staring at the ceiling, contemplating how profoundly a single rainy afternoon could rewrite the map of a life. The squall had passed, leaving traces on hair, coats, and memory. Tomorrow would demand schedules, work calls, and routines. Yet tonight, the world had been smaller, more intimate, and every heartbeat, every shiver, every laugh had stitched a new rhythm into the pattern of their lives. The teacup cooled between them, its rim catching reflections from the lamplight. Grace stirred sugar absent-mindedly, watching the swirl of cream fade into amber. Oliver sat opposite, hands wrapped around his own cup, fingers tense. He didn't look like a man at ease. The quiet was heavy, but not oppressive. Grace sensed truth moving closer, arriving by the way his voice faltered when he finally spoke. I wanted to help, Oliver began, voice low, careful. The groceries, the mechanic voucher, the museum opening. I arranged it all. His hands trembled slightly as he set the cup down. I thought I could make it easier for you. Grace froze. The words, simple yet deliberate, landed with a sharpness that startled her. Gratitude, initially warm and flickering, twisted into a bruising ache. She blinked against it, trying to name the feeling. You call it help, she said slowly. I call it control. Strings pulled where I wasn't even aware I was dancing. That's the difference. Oliver swallowed. He nodded, his mouth tightening. I thought if I arranged the pieces, it would show I care. The words hovered, tentative, but even as he spoke, Grace felt the edges of trust fray, the warmth of shared moments, the small bonding over tides and rain, now collided with this revelation. She sat back, folding her hands over her lap, feeling both the weight and the clarity. I need space, she said, steady, for the kids, for me. No visits, no orchestrated surprises. I need to breathe and think without feeling manipulated. Her voice was calm, but firm. The finality of her boundary left a hollow in the room that neither could fill immediately. Oliver's shoulders slumped. He wanted to reach for her hand, to explain, to fix it, but he paused. He recognized the line he had crossed. The man who measured investments, projections, and risks was suddenly confronted with the human equation he hadn't accounted for. Numbers could not predict the cost of a fracture in trust. The phone buzzed on the table, investors pressing, winter cuts awaiting approval. Oliver exhaled, stiffened, and returned to spreadsheet mode in his mind. Decisions, deadlines, percentages, he let them crowd out shame and guilt. Yet the echo of Grace's words lingered. Control had masqueraded as care, and the line had been noticed. Grace, meanwhile, cataloged shifts, daycare hours, and the intermittent diner schedules she had taken up to make ends meet. She jotted notes in the margin of a notebook, marking interviews she'd lined up. Yet the exhaustion of endless calculation pressed down. Each opportunity seemed tiny, fragile, yet necessary. She balanced gratitude, resentment, and survival in a way only someone living fully in the frayed edges of life could. The evening stretched, punctuated by the quiet scraping of chairs, the hiss of teacups, and the muted wind outside. Oliver glanced at her across the table. The room had grown still, as if holding its breath. He realized that love had collided violently with his secret orchestration, and the result was fracture, not harmony. He had tried to ease her path, but the cost had been autonomy, trust, and clarity. Grace's eyes lingered on the rain streaking the window. She remembered puddles, the pier, laughter echoing under planks, and the brief kiss that had seemed so simple and earned. That memory felt distant now, as if a sudden shadow had passed over the sunlit clarity of the past week. She did not regret connection, but she could not ignore the mechanics behind it, the unseen strings. Oliver ran a hand through his hair, feeling the stiffness of shame and the twinge of remorse in the pit of his chest. Words felt insufficient. He could no longer rely on gestures or silent arrangements to communicate care. He had learned, painfully, that trust required transparency, and manipulation, however small or well-intentioned, undermined it entirely. The night deepened. Grace stood to clear the teacup from the table, her movements deliberate. Oliver followed with an apologetic glance, hands empty. No gesture could undo the internal turmoil. No words could immediately stitch the trust that had cracked. The twins slept upstairs, their breathing a soft rhythm against the quiet chaos of adult emotion. Grace paused by the window, noting the stars hidden behind clouds. The night felt heavy, reflective, a marker between what had been and what might yet be. She acknowledged the complexity of feelings, gratitude, hurt, longing, and let herself experience them without judgment. She could feel the edges of love, yet recognize the limits imposed by honesty. Oliver lingered, watching her silhouette against the dim glow of lamplight. He understood that care without consent or awareness could wound rather than heal. He had attempted to script luck, to arrange fortune, to make life easier. Instead, he had taught a lesson in vigilance, in the cost of unseen influence. The air between them held tension. Yes, but also a strange kind of potential. Boundaries established today did not preclude connection tomorrow, yet they demanded respect, patience, and humility. Oliver's thoughts were meticulous, circling around how to restore trust without erasing the lessons learned. Grace finally turned from the window. She did not speak. She did not need to. The pause said everything: the need for autonomy, for processing, for a life that moved on its own terms. Oliver nodded subtly, as if acknowledging an unspoken pact. He would wait, he would respect, and he would confront the weight of his own intentions. The house fell silent, save for the distant hum of a refrigerator and the soft tick of a wall clock. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches, a reminder that life moves forward, regardless of internal turbulence. The night stretched long, yet full of reflection, each heartbeat a meditation on mistakes, intentions, and the delicate architecture of human trust. Then, a knock shattered the quiet. Grace's pulse quickened, curiosity and caution in equal measure. The past, bearing a familiar grin, had arrived unbidden, leaving the air charged with potential mischief or trouble. The timing was deliberate, unsettling, and immediate. Grace glanced at Oliver, noting the subtle tension in his stance. She did not yet know what awaited outside the door, but she recognized the inevitability of confrontation with history. The night, already heavy with revelations, was about to add another layer. The teacups sat on the table, long, cold, like the delicate balance of emotion between them. Outside, the shadows waited, patient, Chad Whitman leaned on the door jamb as though he had never truly left. The edge of his smile carried old familiarity, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He mentioned debts first, as if rehearsed, then the forged loan in Grace's name. Finally, the twins. His words struck like currency people as bargaining chips. Grace felt her chest tighten, muscles coiling in measured tension. She steadied her breath, counting silently to 10. Chad stepped closer, voice low and threatening. 60,000, he said, and I vanish. Sign away any rights, or you'll find your little paradise splashed in headlines. Hotel owner, heiress, you name it, everyone will know. Every syllable dripped with danger. Grace's mind ran fast, cataloging every potential consequence. Yet, her posture remained firm. Tremors ran through her hands, but her jaw stayed set. She would not falter in front of her children. The twins' laughter and small footsteps echoed from upstairs, grounding her in the present, shielding her from panic. She stepped back, giving him no inch. You're asking me to gamble with more than money, she said softly, deliberately. You're asking me to risk my life, my kids, my community. That's not something I negotiate. Outside, the wind whipped against the windows. The weather radio crackled, warning of a king-tide storm heading fast along the Pacific coast. Town crews prepped, families battened down, and the Holloway Hotel lined its seawall with sandbags. The air carried the scent of salt and urgency, and even the street lamps flickered as if anticipating chaos. Sheriff Dana Cole arrived quietly behind Grace, notebook in hand, presence calm but authoritative. She explained the law, outlining options, including a sting operation should Chad overplay his hand. She spoke in measured sentences, letting each pause sink in. Grace nodded, tension tightening in her shoulders, heart hammering. Every step required calculation, restraint, courage. Meanwhile, Oliver received an urgent call from Hank. Investor meetings pressed, but Hank's advice was clear. Prioritize staff safety over profit comfort. Winter cuts could wait. Human lives could not. Oliver's mind whirred through spreadsheets, scenarios, projections. He drafted a revised winter plan that protected hotel staff and opened shelter space for those threatened by the storm surge. His chest felt tight, but clarity emerged through action. Grace returned to her diner shifts and preschool drop-offs, exhaustion folding around her like a second skin. Every movement pouring coffee, wiping counters, fastening tiny shoes demanded focus, resilience, discipline, yet the weight of Chad's threat hovered above her, a shadow she carried silently. Thoughts flickered between fear and strategy. Each mundane action felt like a lifeline, anchoring her in a world she could still control. Chad's presence lingered even after the door closed behind him. The memory of his lean, the threat in his tone, the sense of moral stakes pressing against practical ones, it haunted the edges of her mind. Grace considered every angle payment or defiance, exposure or discretion. She recognized that this choice would define more than her wallet. It would define her strength, her children's safety, her ethics. Oliver moved deliberately, balancing phone calls with planners, maps with weather alerts. He checked each sandbag placement, each contingency plan, even as investors pressed for cold calculations. His mind returned again and again to Grace. He thought of her steadiness, her bravery under strain, her capacity to protect and nurture. The moral weight of the situation pressed equally on him. The storm grew louder outside, wind whistling through cracks and shutters, the king tide approaching the pier. The twins slept, unaware of the tension compressing the evening into a fragile line between calm and disaster. Grace felt the dual pressure, Chad's threat, and the storm's advance. It was not merely money at stake, nor even safety alone. It was everything that defined her life and community. Hank's voice reached Oliver over the phone. Remember what you stand for. Keep people first. Money second. Don't let pressure dictate what matters. Oliver absorbed the advice, drafting new plans that accounted for staff, guests, and storm victims alike, calculations balanced against humanity, strategy anchored in ethics. Grace paused in the diner's back room, gripping a coffee mug. Her mind raced through hours, days, and weeks of effort, trying to triangulate a safe path through moral and physical danger. Each choice required courage. Each potential misstep could cascade into disaster. Yet, she refused to crumble. Night deepened, shadows folding into the corners of the room. Outside, the town braced. Oliver finalized spreadsheets, confirming extra shelter rooms, contingency staffing, and communication chains. He imagined Grace walking home, twins asleep in the car, heart steady, jaw set. The stakes had expanded from money to life and integrity, and yet human decency remained central. Then headlights appeared at the lighthouse overlook. They swept across wet roads, glinting water, and sandbags, and paused on a familiar black briefcase resting in the passenger seat. It seemed heavier than money. Grace's pulse quickened, chest tightening against the sudden realization whatever was in that case could change everything. She glanced toward Oliver, who stood near the hotel, hands in his pockets, mind racing through mitigation plans. Neither spoke, but both recognized the gravity of the moment. Preparation met uncertainty, courage met fear, responsibility met temptation. The wind carried a hint of salt and rain, brushing against windows and shivering branches. Grace took a steadying breath. She would face what came next with intention, with clarity, and with the same unwavering resolve that had carried her through the past week's storms. The briefcase remained, a silent sentinel at the edge of her life, marking a turning point. Outside, the king tide continued its inexorable approach. Inside, the weight of moral choices, practical decisions, and the past's shadow converged. Grace's jaw set. The night held its breath. She knew the coming hours would test every skill, every instinct, every ounce of courage. And yet, beneath the pressure, a deep, quiet confidence pulsed. She would act, she would decide, and she would endure. The door, the storm, the briefcase, all were part of the moment she had been preparing for, in small actions, long nights, and careful courage. The lighthouse beam cut arcs across the overlook, glinting off rain-slicked asphalt. Drops slid down windshields in slow rivulets, the world blurred by wet night and wind. Grace's hands clutched her coat lapels, knuckles white beneath the fabric, her gaze fixed on the briefcase. Every detail felt heightened, the slick grip of the handle, Chad Whitman's tense posture, the faint metallic glint in the streetlight. Nearby, a recorder clicked quietly, counting breaths, capturing every syllable. Sheriff Dana Cole's team waited in shadowed positions. The tension hummed in the damp air, mixing with the distant roar of ocean waves, every movement measured, every step calculated. Chad bent toward the briefcase, muttering threats with that same familiar edge, promising consequences that seemed to hang heavier than the night itself. Grace's pulse quickened, yet her stance was steady. She could see the futility of his bluster. This time, the past would not hold sway. The team moved in precise synchronization. Chad froze, realizing too late the perimeter had been secured. Clicks of handcuffs punctuated the rain. His voice rose, angry, defiant, then faded into echoes as he was led toward the cruiser. Forged loan documents, meticulously prepared by Dana's office, secured the case beyond doubt. Grace exhaled slowly, the tight coil of fear in her chest loosening fractionally. Simultaneously, Oliver was far from the lighthouse, opening the Holloway's shuttered wing. Rain drummed on the metal roof as he welcomed evacuees, guiding them through hallways lined with sandbags and emergency signage. Volunteers carried blankets. Cooks ladled chowder into bowls with careful rhythm. Oliver himself handed a steaming bowl to an elderly man. Noticing the tremor in his hands, compassion mirrored efficiency. Phone calls came fast. Investor voices clipped and impatient. Complaints about revenue lost to storm prep and overtime payments rang sharply through his office. Oliver listened, then accepted the hit without flinching. He measured each word, choosing patience over defensiveness, logic over fear. In the storm's aftermath, the balance between humanity and business shifted, and he had chosen well. Grace watched from the overlook as the cruiser pulled away. The rain softened, blending into mist, yet the ocean's roar remained constant. She allowed herself a quiet smile. The briefcase's weight no longer symbolic, but definitive. Justice had arrived, not through vengeance, but through careful planning, community cooperation, and unwavering moral clarity. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside the town and its people. Families huddled in chairs, children pressed to laps, blankets warming shoulders. Volunteers moved silently, yet decisively. Every small gesture, pouring tea, folding towels, checking on a child, resonated deeply. Grace's chest loosened further. For weeks, she had carried fear, pressure, and responsibility. Now, witnessing the organized calm and the humanity surrounding her, the tension ebbed. Oliver walked among the evacuees, noting faces, offering quiet reassurance, attending to practical needs. He paused at the chowder table to pour a second bowl for a teenage girl who had helped carry sandbags. Their brief exchange, thankful smiles. A nod spoke volumes. Leadership through empathy. Responsibility through action. His compass had shifted visibly over these hours. Back at the overlook, Grace felt the wind ease. The lighthouse continued its measured sweep, casting intermittent light across wet sidewalks. Brooms and shovels leaned against curbs, rain-washed but ready for morning work. The weight of unfinished tasks, of small errors and personal regrets, felt lighter. Renewal threaded through every wet brick, every sandbag, every quiet moment of generosity she had witnessed tonight. In the hush between lulls of rainfall, Grace allowed herself a glance toward Oliver, now returning from the shelter wing, jacket damp but hair untangled, eyes scanning calmly for lingering needs. A subtle nod passed between them, unspoken yet profound. Trust, tested and fragile, now felt tangible. Small acts had accumulated into a visible shift. The night carried the scent of salt and rain, mingling with faint warmth from lights in the shelter. Conversations were low. Volunteers communicated with glances. The town's rhythm had adjusted to crisis with grace and patience, echoing the lessons Grace had learned over recent weeks. Vigilance paired with care, preparation paired with generosity. Outside, the storm abated slowly, leaving reflective puddles that mirrored lamplight. Shadows moved, fleeting but steady. Grace stepped forward, letting rain-damp hair cling to her cheeks. She could almost feel the weight of fear lift fully from her shoulders. The briefcase had been a fulcrum, the storm a test. Both had delivered clarity, justice, care, and the resilience of community. Oliver approached the overlook, rain dripping from his coat onto wet asphalt. Their eyes met. Gratitude, relief, and unspoken understanding passed between them. The choices made had tested limits, both moral and physical, and yet, in that convergence of night, rain, and responsibility, both recognized that measured courage and empathy would always prevail. The horizon lightened subtly as dawn approached. Streetlights reflected off slick sidewalks. Brooms and shovels gathered on wet curbs, ready for cleanup. Volunteers whispered, stretching arms and backs after hours of labor. Small acts of recovery, community rebuilding, and second chances were visible everywhere. Grace inhaled deeply. The storm's aftermath promised not only physical repair, but renewal of trust, hope, and agency. For the first time in many nights, Grace allowed herself a moment's pause. She could see the path forward, careful, determined, compassionate. Oliver's steady presence, the law's intervention, the town's solidarity all aligned into clarity. Dawn would bring chores, challenges, and still unresolved questions. Yet tonight had proven that perseverance, moral courage, and quiet leadership could alter outcomes. The lighthouse continued its sweep. Its light caught the gleam of wet windows, the occasional reflective puddle, and the faint smile on Grace's lips. The briefcase was gone, the threat dissolved, the storm's lessons remained. In the quiet spaces between action, between breaths, Grace felt the deep pulse of relief. She was not powerless. She had survived, she had protected, and she had witnessed justice carried out. And so, the town, drenched but steadfast, waited for dawn, brooms rested upright, volunteers leaned on shovels, and both Grace and Oliver knew the small, everyday courage of community could outshine any darkness. The storm had left the streets gleaming, slick with rainwater, and the beach beyond shimmered with glassy kelp, tangled in sun-wet sand. Small puddles reflected the sky, fractured and soft, the air smelling of salt and washed earth. Grace stood across the street, a jar of assorted seashells cradled in her hands. She tilted it slightly, letting light dance along ridges and spirals, each shell a tiny memory, a promise saved in miniature. Oliver worked steadily at the curb, sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots muddied, gripping a shovel as he cleared sand and debris from the walkway. Sweat beaded on his brow, despite the coolness in the air. He paused, brushing back damp hair, glancing up when he saw Grace, the jar catching his attention. There was no grand gesture yet, only the quiet acknowledgement of shared history, mutual effort, and present care. He straightened and walked toward her. His movements were deliberate, measured, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry," he said simply. No excuses followed, no attempts to rewrite the past. Only the weight of acknowledgement and a promise to build together. Or not at all. Grace felt the sincerity settle deep in her chest. For once, words did not collide with calculation. They carried only intention. The twins Ava and Eli had been exploring the edge of the beach, collecting shells, and now they sprinted to him, small feet splashing shallow puddles. "Look, we saved them for later." Ava called, waving a clam half covered in sand. "And later is finally here," Eli added, voice high and excited. Grace watched as the children bridged months of distance with laughter and exuberance. Their innocence and hope made the moment luminous. Marianne Bennett stood nearby, steadying herself on a railing. Her soft nod carried a quiet pride, eyes warm beneath thin-rimmed glasses. Across the street, Vera Muse gave a subtle, approving glance. Neighbors who had witnessed the shelter's transformation and the storm's small miracles remembered the nights and hands that had kept them safe. Recognition passed silently through gestures and glances. At the Halloways' garden, preparations for a modest gathering had begun. Staff brought potted plants, chairs, and small bowls of snacks. Volunteers adjusted tablecloths and pinned floral arrangements. Ava and Eli dashed between flower beds, tossing shells into the air like petals, letting them scatter across the ground with joyful abandon. Their laughter mingled with the soft hum of conversation, carrying through the garden with lightness. Oliver knelt among the twins for a moment, collecting shells from their small hands and placing them carefully in the jar Grace had carried. Every movement was thoughtful, deliberate, yet tender. Grace stepped closer, jar cradled like an offering, eyes following his gestures. A small wind teased strands of her hair across her face. He lifted the jar gently, examining it, appreciating the curve and color, the history each shell represented, and the present it now contained. Then, with a calm certainty, Oliver rose, facing Grace fully. The moment drew quiet from the garden. Staff paused. Neighbors stopped adjusting decorations. Even the twins slowed, sensing the change in rhythm. Oliver took a breath and, voice steady but soft, proposed, not with flourish or pressure, but with the simplicity of truth and commitment. The words, carefully chosen and intentionally slow, carried past the garden beds and into the hearts of everyone present. Grace's chest tightened, her throat wet, as she absorbed the weight and clarity of his gesture. Tears glimmered unbidden in the corners of her eyes. She could see weeks of struggle, of fear, and of small acts of courage distilled into this one moment of choice. It was not about spectacle, it was about presence, trust, and the willingness to step into a shared future. The twins erupted into squeals, scattering shells in arcs across the flower beds. Ava jumped into Oliver's side. Eli clutched his hand, and laughter floated above the garden in airy ribbons. Grace's lips curved upward, a laugh mixing with tears. Each shell in the jar now symbolized survival, patience, and the possibility of new beginnings. Oliver stepped closer, gently brushing damp hair from Grace's face. He held her hands, aligning their fingers naturally, without rush. The garden, the town, the shell-strewn sand all became a frame for this quiet affirmation. There was no audience beyond the supportive onlookers, no need for grandeur, only presence, only acknowledgement of shared history, and the silent commitment that they would build something together. Marianne's eyes glistened with quiet emotion. Vera's gaze lingered, filled with recognition of courage and constancy. The garden seemed to hold its breath, each flower and each leaf aware of the gravity and simplicity. The shells glimmered in soft light, reflections of moments past and moments yet to come. Grace's voice broke first, small and trembling, but full of certainty. "Yes," she whispered, letting laughter bubble through as tears fell. The twins cheered, tossing shells high, watching them arc through the air and land in gentle splashes across the soil. It was not a finale, not an ending, but a beginning, a declaration that life would continue with hope, care, and presence at the center. Oliver drew her close, hands firm yet gentle around her shoulders, guiding her into a slow, grounding embrace. The garden felt full not of spectacle, but of reality and promise. The sound of children's laughter, the subtle rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of contented adults, all created a harmony of reassurance and anticipation. The sun broke through the clouds in scattered shafts, illuminating raindrops on petals and glinting off the shells. Grace held the jar tightly, then offered it to Oliver with a soft smile, letting him share the memory, the significance, the hope it contained, together. They placed the shells in a corner of the garden, a testament to patience, care, and the journey that had brought them here. The day stretched forward gently. The storm's memory lingered in damp soil and salted air, but lightness pervaded every gesture, every laugh, every glance shared between them. They moved through the garden, through the small crowd of neighbors and staff, with an ease that had been hard-earned, shared meals, shared responsibility, shared attention to children and community, all reinforced a new pattern of trust and companionship. Grace laughed again, fully, while Oliver rested a hand on her back. The twins scrambled for another shell, calling for their father's attention, while adults in the garden quietly observed, nodding with soft smiles. Each person carried the story differently, yet each understood resilience, honesty, care, and small consistent acts built something stronger than any storm. The shells in the jar glimmered as the afternoon sun warmed the wet sand. Grace and Oliver exchanged glances, silent and comprehensive, understanding that this moment, the proposal, the public acknowledgement, the presence of children and neighbors was a living promise. Not a conclusion, not a capstone, but the first frame of life lived deliberately, joyfully, and together. For Grace, the tightness in her chest released fully. She felt both relief and anticipation. The past had been hard, the future uncertain. Yet today, with the jars of shells, laughter, sun, and soaked flowers, she could believe in love as a careful shared work, a practice of small, persistent, thoughtful gestures. And so, in the soft light of early afternoon, with the storm fading behind them, Grace said yes fully, with tears and laughter mingled. What followed was not a finale, but a way to live together, attentive and open to life's quiet, enduring joys. The lobby of the Holloway smelled of fresh bread, mingled with the faint tang of sea salt lingering from the previous week's storm. Sunlight sifted through tall windows, illuminating kids' artwork taped to walls and shelves. Shell mosaics, handprints, and finger-painted rainbows framed black and white photographs of cots lined in neat rows. memories of the nights when the hotel had become a haven for neighbors weathering wind and water. Grace hummed softly, moving through the space with a rhythm formed of habit and care, packing school lunches for Ava and Eli, sandwiches lined up in wax paper, an orange tucked beside a thermos of milk, a note folded in to remind the twins of the garden song she had sung last spring. Oliver stirred batter at the counter, apron dusted with flour, following the scent as it curled up from the bowl. He glanced at Grace, noticing the tilt of her shoulders, the way she paused to smooth a stray lock of hair from Eli's forehead. There was no rush, no clamor of meetings or investor deadlines pressed against the walls this Sunday morning, just the warmth of ordinary presence, the quiet orchestration of daily life that had become their shared domain. Outside, the faint murmur of the harbor carried in through open doors. Seagulls wheeled above, calling in a distant rhythm, and the smell of brine mixed with baking bread. Grace slid a thermos into Ava's little backpack, and the twins scurried toward the door, backpacks bouncing, shoes squeaking against polished floorboards. Oliver knelt briefly to adjust Eli's scarf, tucking it snugly around the neck, and they all exchanged a soft, wordless laugh. It was a small morning ritual, but it carried the weight of years, a ceremony of survival, care, and presence. In the garden outside, weeds were pulled with patient fingers, and the twins hummed along with Grace's voice, soft and steady, as if the garden itself remembered the lullabies and labor alike. Wooden benches had been repaired, and flower beds replenished with fresh soil and seeds. Vera Muse wandered past, carrying a watering can, nodding at the children, whose small hands shook loose soil from roots, eyes bright with simple wonder. Even the community that had gathered during the storm now lingered casually, observing, smiling quietly at lives reordered by compassion and effort. Oliver had begun funding a yearly staff relief fund, ensuring that winter no longer carried the dread it once did. Employees whispered thanks when they realized the insurance gap and wage stress had been eased through this small, structured gesture. The Holloway's walls now held pictures that captured both purpose and humanity. Neighbors shoveling snow, children carrying shells, staff coordinating meals for evacuees, laughter amid wind and rain. Each image was a testament to shared endurance and care, a chronicle of resilience beyond the ledger. Grace's morning moved deliberately, almost meditative. She hummed while slicing oranges, spreading peanut butter evenly, slipping notes into lunch boxes. Ava and Eli practiced tying shoelaces in bursts of giggles. Oliver glanced at the clock, but let the rhythm remain untouched, aware that these small tasks carried more gravity than any boardroom decision. Each action packing a lunch, adjusting a coat, stacking dishes echoed with meaning. It was a quiet triumph, ordinary yet monumental. After breakfast, the family gathered outside briefly. Oliver's hands, calloused from shoveling and care, held a small rake as he leveled soil in the flower beds. Grace's gaze followed the line of his movements, noting the careful attention, the balance of precision and gentleness. "The kids will notice if we miss a patch," she said softly. He smiled, a faint lift at the corner of his mouth, and continued without comment, letting actions speak. The twins chased a small butterfly across the yard, giggling, while Grace tied ribbons onto small garden stakes to mark where wildflowers would bloom in spring. Each gesture, each placement of a plant, carried with it the weight of memory and hope. The garden, once a refuge, was now a space of ongoing growth, sustained effort, and visible joy. Neighbors passed by, exchanging nods or a brief word, reminders of community threads that had been woven tighter through the storm and the weeks after. By mid-morning, Oliver and Grace stood side by side at the kitchen counter, a quiet concord in movement. He poured coffee, she arranged dishes for later. Their eyes met over the rim of mugs, not needing words. The past storms, the threats, the uncertainty they all felt distant, softened by the warmth of shared labor and attentiveness. It was not perfection, but life, the choices made deliberately, day after day, to nurture family, community, and love. In the lobby, the twins returned with backpacks, dropping off small finds from the garden, a smooth pebble, a broken shell, a stray leaf. Grace collected these in a small basket, placing them alongside other tokens of memory. Oliver noticed her methodical care, the gentle sorting, the reverence in her gaze. There was no rush, no performance, only the attentive shaping of daily life into a form that mattered. The sun climbed higher, casting long lines of light across polished floors. Bread baked, butter softened. Grace hummed another garden song, and Ava and Eli joined softly, laughter trailing behind each note. Oliver stirred gently, adding a pinch of salt to a batter and tasting, approving the quiet alchemy of ordinary work. The hotel, the home, the garden, they were all together, threaded with presence, kindness, and care. By late morning, neighbors and friends had drifted past, leaving small tokens, a jar of jam, a loaf of bread, a note. Each contributed to the rhythm of life, reinforcing the idea that true wealth lay in faces at your table when wind rises and storms pass. Grace and Oliver watched the twins chase shadows across the courtyard, hand in hand, and understood that the choices they made daily were the cumulative victories, not dramatic gestures alone. And in that gentle light, Grace glanced at Oliver, the children, the shells, the bread, and the garden. She understood the quiet triumph of life, chosen deliberately, carefully, and with love. The past had been turbulent, the journey hard, but each day offered a chance to rebuild, sustain, and celebrate what truly mattered. Grace looked out at the harbor, a line of water glinting in morning sun, and let herself breathe fully. Oliver's hand brushed hers as they walked toward the door to take the twins to preschool, small gestures anchoring a larger truth. They had weathered storms together, both literal and figurative. And now, in the gentle cadence of ordinary life, they lived deliberately, guided by care, kindness, and quiet commitment. The day continued, unremarkable in action but monumental in meaning. The smell of baking bread, the laughter of children, the hum of preparation all carried the weight of chosen life, of shared hope, and of home. Grace hummed once more, the melody threading through sunlight and memory, an invitation to notice the ordinary magic of kindness, effort, and presence. It was not a finale, it was a living, breathing reminder that love and community endure in small, repeated gestures, in meals shared, gardens tended, and hands held when wind rises. And in that truth, the harbor light shone not in storm, but in the careful, persistent glow of life chosen with heart. Life often measures success in wealth, punctuality, and control, yet the richest lessons emerge in moments of vulnerability, kindness, and quiet courage. Grace Bennett's journey reminds us that resilience is not merely enduring hardship, but choosing empathy and patience amidst the daily grind. Her small acts of care for her twins, even when resources are scarce, reveal that love and attention, no matter how humble shape, lives far more deeply than money or status. Oliver Grant's story mirrors a different truth. Authority and precision may command respect, but it is humility and witnessing others' struggles that open the heart. Learning to see beyond one's rigid routines, to recognize the humanity in another, transforms not only relationships, but the way we experience life itself. For those of us in later chapters, the story offers reassurance change is possible at any age, and connections forged through understanding, kindness, and honesty bring more enduring satisfaction than any ledger or contract. It teaches that generosity, boundaries, and trust coexist, and that the courage to both give and receive support creates a richer, more meaningful life. Ultimately, the tale encourages reflection. Where can we soften? Who can we help? And what moments of quiet care might ripple into lasting change? Thank you so much for joining us on this heartfelt journey. We hope Grace and Oliver's story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of kindness, resilience, and love. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more inspiring tales. Your support means the world and helps us bring more stories that warm the heart and uplift the spirit.